In 1953, a democracy was overthrown. The people who did it called it a success. Then they hid the proof for 60 years. This is the story of Iran. A country with an elected leader, a country sitting on an ocean of oil, and a secret plan run by two of the most powerful governments on earth to remove that leader and put a king back on his throne. It was called Operation Ajax. The CIA ran it. Britain helped. And for 6 decades, both of them denied it ever happened. Here's why you should care about a coup from 70 years ago. The fallout from that one summer never stopped. It ran straight through the next 30 years and helped set the Middle East on the path it's still walking today. Angry crowds, a captured embassy, a broken trust between two nations. A lot of it traces back to this. So I want to answer a simple question. How does one government secretly overthrow another, and then look the world in the eye and call it a win? By the end of this, you'll understand exactly how it was done, who paid for it, who lied, and why the victory they celebrated turned out to be the very thing that came back to destroy everything they were trying to protect. Let's start where all of this really started, with the oil. Chapter 1. The Man Who Took Back the Oil. To understand the coup, you have to understand what people were fighting over. And the whole thing comes down to one thing under the ground: oil. Back in 1901, a British businessman got permission to search for oil in Iran. It took him 7 years, but in 1908, he struck it, a huge amount of it. And out of that came a British company that would control Iran's oil for the next 40 years. Now think about what that means. The oil was in Iran. It was under Iranian soil, but a foreign company owned it, ran it, and kept most of the money. The Iranians did the dangerous work in the refineries. They lived in the shadow of the company town, and most of the profits sailed off to Britain. For decades, Iran was one of the poorest places in the region, sitting on top of some of the richest oil on the planet. People noticed. Of course they did. How could you not? And out of that anger came a man named Mohammad Mossadegh. Let me tell you about him, because he matters. Mossadegh was elected. He was Iran's prime minister, chosen by the country's parliament, and he was wildly popular. He was old, thin, often sick, sometimes wept in public when he spoke about his country. His enemies laughed at him for it. His people loved him for it. To them, he was the man who finally said out loud what everyone had been thinking for years. And what he said was simple: the oil is ours. In 1951, Mossadegh did something bold. He nationalized the oil. That's a big word, so let me make it plain. He took the oil away from the British company and handed it back to the Iranian people. From now on, the profits from Iran's oil would belong to Iran. He wasn't even greedy about it. His government asked the British company a fair question first. It asked to see the books, to check whether Iran was being paid what it was owed. The company refused. It wouldn't even open its records. So the parliament voted. The oil was nationalized. And across Iran, people celebrated in the streets. For the first time in living memory, it felt like the country belonged to the people who lived in it. But here's the thing. When you take a fortune away from powerful men, you don't just make them angry, you make them dangerous. And in London, some very powerful men had just watched their fortune walk out the door. Chapter 2. The Fear That Did the Trick. Britain was furious. Understand what had just happened from their side. For 40 years, that oil company had been one of Britain's crown jewels. The British government itself owned a big share of it, and now some prime minister in Tehran had simply taken it. So Britain fought back, not with an army, at least not yet, with money and pressure. They pulled their workers out of the refineries, betting Iran couldn't run the oil business without them. They organized a blockade, so Iran couldn't sell its oil to anyone. Ships that tried to buy it were threatened. They dragged Iran in front of the World Court. They squeezed and squeezed and squeezed, and it hurt. Iran's oil money dried up. The country's finances started to bleed. Life got harder for ordinary people. But Mossadegh didn't fold. That's the part Britain couldn't stand. They threw everything at him, and the old man just held on. His people were suffering, but they were still with him, because to them this was about pride. Better to be poor and free than rich and owned. So Britain had a problem. They couldn't force him out on their own. They'd tried, and they'd failed. And that's when they turned to the one country big enough to finish the job, the United States. But there was a catch. At first, Washington wasn't interested. The American president at the time, Harry Truman, didn't want to help Britain grab back an oil company. That wasn't America's fight. So Britain got clever. They stopped talking about oil. Instead, they told Washington a story about something else. Something that terrified every American leader in those years. Communism. You have to remember the moment. This was the Cold War. America and the Soviet Union were locked in a standoff that felt like it could turn into the end of the world at any second. And the Soviet Union shared a long border with Iran, right next door. Iran also had a small communist party of its own, and Britain used that. They painted a picture for the Americans. Mossadegh, they said, was weak. He was letting the country drift. And any day now, the communists would sweep in, and Iran, and all that oil, and that border with Russia would fall to the Soviets. Now here's what matters. It wasn't true. Mossadegh wasn't a communist. He actually distrusted the Soviets. There was no real evidence he was about to hand his country to Moscow. But it didn't have to be true. It only had to be scary. And in 1953, a new president took office in America, Dwight Eisenhower. His people were harder, more willing to act in the shadows. They heard the story about communism, and the fear did what the truth never could. Washington said yes. Now the only question left was how. How do you overthrow a government without the world ever knowing you did it? The CIA thought it had the answer. Chapter 3. How to topple a government. The plan had a name. The Americans called it Operation Ajax. The British called it Operation Boot. And the man sent to run it on the ground was named Kermit Roosevelt. You might recognize the last name. He was the grandson of an American president, Theodore Roosevelt. But he wasn't a soldier. By all accounts, he was quiet, polite, easy to underestimate, a spy who didn't look like a spy. In the summer of 1953, he slipped into Iran under a fake name to run one of the most secret operations of the entire Cold War. He came with about $1 million. That was a fortune back then, and that money was the whole engine of the plan. So let me show you exactly how you overthrow a government in secret, because it's simpler and uglier than you might think. It came down to 4 moves. First, you buy the newspapers. The CIA paid Iranian editors and writers to print lies about Mossadegh, made-up stories, fake outrage. Day after day, Iranians opened their papers and read that their prime minister was a crook, or a communist, or losing his mind. None of it real. All of it paid for. Second, you buy people. The operation handed out money to politicians, to religious leaders, to army officers. Some took the cash to switch sides. Some took it to stay quiet. Slowly, the CIA bought itself a network of people inside Iran who would move when they were told to. Third, you rent a mob. This is the part people find hardest to believe. The CIA paid crowds to fill the streets. Some pretended to support Mossadegh and then turned violent, to make him look like he'd lost control of the country. The chaos in the streets wasn't real anger from real people. A lot of it was staged and paid for by the hour. And fourth, you find your general and your king. The CIA settled on an Iranian general named Fazlollah Zahedi to take Mossadegh's place, and they needed the Shah, Iran's young king, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to make it look legal. The Shah had the power, on paper, to dismiss the prime minister. So the plan was to get him to sign an order firing Mossadegh and then have the army and the crowds do the rest. That was it. Fake news, bribes, paid crowds, a general, and a nervous king with a pen. That was how you were supposed to erase a democracy and leave no fingerprints. Now let me step out of the story for a second and say something plainly, because I think it needs to be said. They called this a victory. For 60 years, the men who ran it told themselves it was a clean, brilliant win. But look at what it actually was. It was lying to a whole country in its own newspapers. It was paying men to riot. It was reaching into another nation and pulling out the leader its people had chosen because a foreign company wanted its oil back. If a country did that to us, we would have one word for it. We wouldn't call it a victory, we'd call it a crime. So here's what I want to know from you. When a powerful government does this in secret, the bribes, the fake news, the paid mobs, and then it works, and they call it a win, what is it really? Is it a victory? Or is it just a crime that happened to succeed? Tell me below. I read the comments on these, and I want to hear how you see it. Because when the plan finally went live, it almost fell apart completely. Chapter 4. 4 days in August. The operation was supposed to be quick. It was anything but. In the middle of August 1953, the plan went into motion. The Shah signed the order dismissing Mossadegh. An officer went to deliver it in the middle of the night, and it failed. Immediately. Mossadegh had been tipped off. Someone had warned him, so when the messenger arrived to hand him his own firing, Mossadegh's people were ready. Instead of stepping down, he had the plotters arrested. The coup collapsed before it even began. Now the Shah panicked. The young king had gambled everything on this working, and it hadn't. Terrified he'd be blamed, he ran. He fled Iran, first to Baghdad, then all the way to Rome. He was so sure he was finished that he reportedly started looking at how he'd live the rest of his life in exile. Back in Washington, the CIA thought it was over too. The message came down from headquarters. The operation had failed. Shut it down. Get our people out before anyone connects this to us. And this is one of the strangest turns in the whole story. Kermit Roosevelt didn't leave. He was on the ground in Tehran, the plan in ruins around him, his own bosses telling him to quit, and he decided to try again anyway. With the money he had left and the people he'd already bought, he started rebuilding for a second attempt. A few days later, on the 19th of August, it all came to a head. The streets of Tehran filled with people. Some of them were paid, some of them were real. And here I have to be honest with you, because this is where the history gets genuinely disputed. For years, the story was that Roosevelt personally pulled the strings on that final day, that the whole thing danced to his tune. But serious historians who've read the documents since aren't so sure. Some argue the CIA lost control of events, and that Roosevelt took credit afterward for a day that partly ran on its own. What's clear is that a mob and army units loyal to General Zahedi moved through the city, and the tide turned against Mossadegh. The violence was real, whoever started it. By the end of that day, an estimated 300 people were dead in the streets of Tehran. The crowds and the soldiers reached Mossadegh's home. His house was shelled. The old man escaped over a back wall as it fell, but there was nowhere left to go. Within a day, the man who had taken back his country's oil was under arrest, and the king came home. The Shah flew back from Rome to a country that was suddenly his again. The general the CIA had chosen became the new prime minister. The oil deal was quietly reopened to Western companies. From the outside, it looked clean. A leader gone, a king restored, order returned. Washington told itself the whole thing had worked perfectly. But a victory that has to be kept secret isn't really finished. It just goes quiet. And the bill for this one hadn't come yet. Chapter 5. The bill comes due. Let's start with the man they overthrew. Mossadegh, the elected leader, the one his people had loved, was put on trial by the government that replaced him. He was never truly free again. He spent the rest of his life under guard, shut away, and he died a prisoner in his own home in 1967. The people weren't even allowed to give him a public funeral because his name still moved them, even then, especially then. And the king they brought back? He didn't rule gently. The Shah understood something after 1953. He understood that his throne rested on foreign help and on force, so he built a machine to keep himself safe. He created a secret police, and for the next 26 years, that secret police became a byword for fear in Iran. People were watched, people were arrested, people were tortured. If you spoke against the king, you could simply disappear. For over 2 decades, the anger just built. Quietly, under the surface, out of sight of the Americans who kept calling Iran a success story. A whole generation grew up knowing 2 things: that their king had been put back on his throne by foreigners, and that their one moment of real democracy had been stolen from them in the streets. That kind of anger doesn't fade, it waits. And in 1979, it finally broke. The Iranian people rose up and drove the Shah out of the country for good. The monarchy the coup had saved collapsed in a matter of months. And what came next was not friendly to the West. It was the opposite. A revolution built, in large part, on the memory of 1953 and everything that followed it. That same year, crowds stormed the American embassy in Tehran. They took 52 Americans hostage, and they held them for 444 days, more than a year. It was a national nightmare for the United States, playing out on the news night after night. Now sit with the irony of that. The whole point of the coup, the reason Washington signed off on it, was to keep Iran stable and keep it friendly to America. That was the promise. That was the win. And it delivered the exact opposite. It handed Iran 26 years of a hated king, then a revolution, then a government that would spend the next generation as one of America's fiercest enemies. Everything the coup was meant to prevent, the coup helped create. For 60 years, the United States wouldn't even admit it had happened. Officials dodged the question. The documents stayed locked away. Iranians knew, they'd always known, but America's own government kept denying its own history. And then, in 2013, it finally stopped denying. The CIA released a document. It was an old internal history, written by the agency itself back in the 1970s, and one line in it says, "Everything." It states, in the agency's own words, that the coup that overthrew Mossadegh was carried out under CIA direction, as an act of American foreign policy. There it was. After 6 decades, in their own files. They did it. They admitted it. So let me bring you back to where we started. They overthrew a democracy. They called it a victory, and then they buried the proof for 60 years. But think about what that really tells you. If it was such a clean win, if it was truly something to be proud of, why did it have to stay a secret for so long? Why hide a victory? Maybe because somewhere, deep down, they always knew what it really was. Not a victory at all, just a crime that worked for a while, until the day the bill came due.